are now going to transition over to our next invited speaker, who will talk to us about practice and sort of the real life world of how we respond to children and their tough questions. JuanCarlos Arauz will be introduced and his questions will be moderated by my colleague, Peter Rockers, who is also part of our Early Childhood Alliance. And I'm gonna turn it over to Peter right now.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. It's very nice to be here with you all. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. JuanCarlos Arauz. Dr. Arauz is the founder of E3, Education, Excellence, and Equity. I want to actually read a brief part of E3's mission statement. E3 actualizes educational equity by reframing excellence. I really like that statement, and I think it resonates quite a bit with what Dean Shard was saying in his opening remarks around reimagining how education systems treat and value children. Dr. Arauz received his doctorate in international and multicultural education from University of San Francisco. He's been an adjunct professor at Dominican University and has served as a trustee for several independent schools and educational organizations. He is a frequent invited speaker, and he uses a creative storytelling approach to address the delicate topics of 21st century education, equity, immigration, and Black-brown male youth development. And I will turn it over now to Dr. Arauz.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am here on the West Coast in California right now, so appreciating the time slot to come in the afternoon and not at 6 a.m. So thank you to the hosts. So I want to just jump into this because I know our time is limited in this as we do the work. And so I think the first thing that I want to just share is really from a storytelling perspective. And that is, I am a parent. I'm a parent of 8 children, 2 that are biological. And so the older ones, the other 6 children we adopted. So they came to me when they were older. The 2 that were biological, I was there, to be able to be there from birth. And what I'll never forget was in visiting, my family in Nicaragua. We went on an excursion and we went to a place, and in this place that we went to, my son was 5 years old, and then my daughter was 3 years old, and we come about, on the side of the road, to relieve ourselves, get some meals, and there was a woman who was feeding us, and very dark skin. She was indigenous. From the Mesquite coast of Nicaragua, for those who know where that is geographically. And my son asks me at 5 years old, "Papi, who are those people? Are they human?" And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, Papi, they're so dark, like you." And I was like, wow, 5 years old, and I'm having to address race already. And I teach on this stuff. And so I realized, oh my goodness. And that sent me on a journey, and it's been 13 years since then, since my son is now 17. And I started to realize the importance of how crucial it is for us as adults, us as caregivers, us as parents, to become comfortable with talking about race, even when our children may not even have the language of race. And so in that, I started to realize that this is only going to continue to perpetuate this space of racism, homophobia, xenophobia, if we as parents, as child caregivers, as adults, do not become comfortable having this conversation. And so the question is, how do you have a conversation about race, and racism to a 5 and 3 year old? And the reality is this: we actually know the answer. because we know that what would happen if we were talking about gender and sexual orientation and so forth. I ask many times in the audience, how might you ask and talk about sex education to your 5-year-old and 3-year-old child? And oftentimes people will respond saying, oh, I don't have that conversation. But I promise you that actually most parents, most child caregivers do have a sex education conversation. They do it by making it more elementary. So they don't talk about sexual intercourse, they talk about your private parts and where you use your private parts and when you can show your private parts and what happens if you touch your private parts. We have these conversations with young children, and that's still part of the sex education. And so the question is, how do you do that about race? And so oftentimes, and you've heard this saying before many times, where people will say, we do not see color. Well, if you do not see color, then you may be colorblind. So that might be a legitimate reason. You may be blind, which may be a legitimate reason. But if you're not those two, you actually do see color. And so do our children at 5 and 3 years old. And so it's important, how do we go ahead and start sharing this information with our young children? So the first step that I encourage us to always consider is the piece about, and I'll just share this view for us, is to understand that we have multiple identities. And so sharing with our children as young as 3 and 5 years old about the multiple identities will enable you to talk about the racial identity. So we often have been triggered, re-triggered, traumatized to not talk about race and racism. But one way to start to understand is, let's start talking about our multiple identities. And so that's the first step that I would encourage us to consider, is to just help our young children to start understanding the differences that exist with our multiple identities, and having them start to see themselves through these multiple identities. So that's just step one, is understanding that we have multiple identities, so that we're also teaching our children that we are not just one identity. I do not want to see people identifying each other only as one identity, but rather the multitude of who we are. The second piece that I started to learn and understand is we need to make sure we create a community of practice. So oftentimes this starts with the adults only, meaning, can we even define what race is? Can we even do that in a session? Can we even define what ethnicity is, and start to realize we actually have different understandings about this? So having a community of practice as adults on a regular basis to talk about these terms will enable us to then have those same conversations to talk about with our children. Because if you're like me, I'll speak to my older children when they were of the teenage adolescent years, and I started to see about how they got interested about specifically sex. Because I was not comfortable talking about sex because of my history with it, I realized that with my boys, I actually didn't have any conversation with my boys. And then with my girls, who were teenage daughters, I had all the conversations with them about how bad sex is and how bad guys are, and don't get around a guy. And I didn't want to have a conversation because I didn't have a community of practice to talk about sex. So in my young age that I am, I'm already a grandfather. And if you were to guess who it's from, is it because of my sons or my daughters? You would guess probably it's my sons, because I never even had a conversation with my sons about sex, which at least with my daughters, I did. So community of practice is a second step that I would highly encourage for us to begin, again, to get to this conversation. How do you talk about race to a 5-year-old? What do you do when the child says, "Mommy, he's so black"? So for offering some theory for us to consider is understanding that in our racial identity development, in the pre-adolescent stage, oh, excuse me. in the pre-adolescent stage that our children do see diversity. They do see these differences. They don't have, however, language. And as a result, it is important to start creating language for them. It is then in their early adolescent years that they start to see diversity and start to connect it to actual individuals and start, however they've been socialized, to add value to this. And it's in this space that then by the time they get to the middle adolescence, they are starting to form these values for themselves based on what has been told to them. So if they've never been talked about race, and they're only now being socialized to seeing different people for the first time on TV or in their own schools or social media, then that becomes the education. And this is where it's so important for us to understand that for early childhood, we have to make sure we're providing that language early on. You all have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of need. It is important to acknowledge that actually Maslow never came up with the concept of a hierarchy. It was actually his students that came up with the concept of the hierarchy. I wasn't there and I wasn't alive to be able to have a conversation with Maslow, but what I want to offer is a conversation about what if we thought about the inverse of Maslow's hierarchy to not be a hierarchy, but rather centering the center of purpose. And when we talk about purpose and self-actualization, and we think about how we love our children, and we have them to see how they love themselves, that how they go out to get their esteem needs, how they go out to get their physiological needs, their sense of belonging, and their safety, they're doing it from a space of purpose, not from a space of absence of what's been socialized upon them. And this is an invitation for us to consider the power of what we can do, again, with 3 to 5 year olds at such a young age to help them see how amazing they are with their multiple identities. Because then they don't go and become older. And when you think about specifically as it relates to race, for the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color, who have so much negative information and they're never necessarily taught positively about their race, how they go about getting their self-esteem and their sense of belonging is very destructive and can be very destructive, where you start seeing in adolescence age, a lot of BIPOC students starting to perpetuate the stereotypes because that's who they think they're supposed to be. So the last slide that I'll share here is this understanding of cycle of socialization by Bobby Harrow. And so I invite you all to be in a query. What is your first memory of life? And if you were to go back, is it positive? Is it negative? How do you attribute that? It was the beginning of your socialization, as we're doing with our children. It gets reinforced by our institutions of how we're taught about race. And then we're either praised or discouraged because of what we think about race. And so what we do know is that currently in society, race is created and perceived as a hierarchy. And so either we choose to stay silent, which only reinforces this cycle, or we end up changing that narrative. And one of the ways we can start changing that narrative is obviously with ourselves, but especially with our children at such a young age. So I share these pieces as, what do we do next? What do we do with our children? Well, I highlight, most importantly, one of many, but here's one of my favorites, Mama Let's Read post. It's an Instagram. I highly recommend that you follow this. It is one of the best resources for early childhood education around books on diversity that are eloquently explaining really the journey. And how did this begin? This began with a mom who had the same story that I had. She's much younger than I am, and she is biracial herself. She German and African American, and in raising her children, her child asked the same question, except this time the child ask, "Mommy, why is daddy so dark?" Because he's Nigerian, very dark skin. And in that space, we had this conversation about what could we do. And what she did was that she said, I'm going to find as many books on diversity that talk about diversity in the most subtle ways, in the most real ways, so that my children grow up learning that diversity is a good thing. Diversity is not something to be afraid of. Diversity is something for us to consider. And at the end of the day, I'll get back to my screen here with all of you. You might be asking yourself, what exactly did I say to my 5-year-old son when he said, Daddy, Papi, why is that person human? And what I did there was ask him, well, do you think I'm human? And he said, well, of course, Papi. Well, then I said, of course, that they're human too. And so the beautiful thing is that we all come in different shades and colors. And so I asked them this question. I said, what color is a rainbow? And they gave me the colors they can think of. And I said, how beautiful is that rainbow? And they kept telling me how beautiful it was. And I said, how beautiful if it was all the same color? And they said, it wouldn't be the same. And I said, that's why we have what we call race. And it means that we have different colors, we come in different shades, and these are the definitions for them. So that was my education at 5 years old with this child that I thought I was going to raise as this anti-racist person, growing up, but didn't realize that I would have to start at such a young age. But I hope that in sharing these pieces with you, and particularly, most importantly, that Instagram of Mama Let's Read, it may provide you all resources to continue to have this conversation with your children and as child care educators with all the children that you bring in, so that when they start this formal process of schooling, it will not be the first time that they'll be exposed to race and have to ask that question inside their head, Mommy, why is that person so dark? So with that, I'll go ahead and pause.
Thank you. And we have time for a few questions if people want to put them in the chat.
We'll also look for if anybody has any reactions, if you want to raise your hand. Sometimes people are slow typers.
I guess what I'm wondering is sometimes as a white person breaking this down, I can fall into the trap of white splaining and speaking for people of color and saying how things are, how things are going to be. So I was kind of wondering if you had any insight on like how to avoid that.
So one of my good friends, Glenn Singleton, you might have heard of his book called Courageous Conversations on Race. One of the principles as he offers is the tenet of accepting the fact of non-closure. It is important to understand that we are not going to quote, do this right. We are going to have missteps. And so you may have this other colleague of mine, Robin DiAngelo, who talks about the concept of white fragility. And it is very scary when you are on the non-target side to have these conversations. I promise you that as a male presenting heterosexual person, I am scared to death to have conversations about gender identity because I don't want to mess up. What I do know is that as a tip that I can offer is offer my perspective and lens and say, as a male, here's what I'm coming up with. This is what I'm noticing. This is my inquiry. This is how I would talk about, these things. So if there's a situation, again, in early childhood where if I'm literally, when I used to, teach and actually work in the early childhood centers, and I'd go in, I would hold the child, and I would be nervous. I would be nervous as a man, like, okay, wait, I can't touch the child. I can't talk to because I'm a guy and everybody's going to think something. And I had to come over and actually then have a conversation with my colleagues and be like, look, I'm a guy here. I'm really nervous about this. I don't want to mess up, but this is what I want to do, right? So in that space, I'm going in with a space of inquiry and collegiality to offer that space. So still standing up as a white ally, I think is important. And then if you do have the resources of talking with another person of color to ask is one way. And always appreciative inquiry is something that would work even with the child. What do you notice? How do you find this? Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Great.
I have
We
another question.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Helen. I was talking earlier about the very issue of diversity. So one of the thing that I think parents in early childhood education community, especially from Asian American community, kind of asking is, what do kids, parents, and family do if they were bullied and discriminated against in early childhood center, and the teachers didn't do anything, and the school community didn't do anything, and it was oppressed for so long? Do you have any suggestions for this population, or just in general? Because I was so heartbroken listening to some of their stories. Some of them just simply move away to another town, but many of the grandparents who are the caregiver for the toddlers and the kids, they don't even speak English well. So a lot of their concerns were not even addressed or communicated. They just kind of let it go because they feel, it's just maybe they're not good enough if they were being bullied, which sometimes is the other way around. They maybe are too involved with their kids' education. They maybe just have much higher expectations sometimes, and then being treated unfairly that way, and the microaggressions, and also sometimes the assumed communication is very biased. It's not fair to where they come from, and sometimes it can have a adverse effect in their family dynamics because of what they experience in the educational setting of of their toddlers and early educator kids.
Yes. Well, thank you for your question. I mean, I think the first thing to respond to, because this is also came up in one of the other questions of like, how do you get this conversation opened even at a staff meeting? What I want to just acknowledge is, talking about race, you're talking about reopening some trauma that we all have experienced consciously or unconsciously, and some of us are currently experiencing that trauma right now, and we're being re-traumatized. So having this conversation is very challenging, no doubt. And as leaders, as allies, we, I think, need to step into this conversation more so than actually stay away from it because of that. So one piece of advice that I can offer is always start with not talking about Dr. Martin Luther King. Do not talk about Dr. Martin Luther King. Let me say that again. Do not introduce race by talking about Dr. Martin Luther King. Start talking about race by talking about George Washington Carver. Do you see the difference here? So what I'm inviting you to do is that when you look at this Instagram post of the books of Mama Let's Read, some of them is about social justice, but do not start there. First, start in your centers showing the beauty, the brilliance of diversity, especially as it relates to race. That becomes your step one, to then talk about the social injustice, the inequities that do exist, that is part of the reality. And obviously, at the end of the day, I think really strongly having a protocol or training, and I'm more than happy to share the protocol that we use to talk about race as a conflict mediation. It's a booklet that we give every educator so that they reflect on how race is showing up for them, so that they become more versed. We can share that with you all. That would be another way for them to have the training on their own, because having an outsider come in, I have learned, is not as effective as actually creating space for individuals to reflect on their own. And that, as leaders, you can ask your colleagues to do, and asking the same thing with your parents to do. in that way. So I hope that answered that question.
Yes, it's just very hard sometimes because, you know, it's a topic a lot of parents and the kids are afraid to address. And that's why I was wondering, because I'm speaking in some of the community forum in addressing this very issue. So if you will be interesting, I would love to invite you also to have that dialogue together in the
Sure.
platform.
That's my my email address.
And it was just really challenging.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah.
I think we have, I think we have some feedback. If everybody could just make sure. they're
Oh,
muted.
yes.
Okay.
So sorry that the echoing. So if possible, we would love to have JuanCarlos. We can coordinate that community meeting, and then with many other teachers together and educator, and then we can maybe, you know, start this conversation at least as a start point for the educators and for the directors in early childhood centers, so that parents can, you know, can feel safe to express without thinking that, you know, they will be targeted or retaliated. I think that's what the parents' concern is how would they be perceived after they speak up.
Well, I wanted to say, Peter, do you want to close it out?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of really great questions still coming in the chat. We don't have time to address them all, but just thank you again to Dr. Arauz, because clearly this is a start, or, you know, this conversation is hopefully ongoing and will continue. And people I think can still sort of follow up with Dr. Arauz as well. I know people are asking to get access to some of these tools that you have. So I'm sure this conversation will keep going, but thank you again. Yeah.
And they're just, I just put in the chat the website where you can get the free videos, the links and the protocols, all those things, so that people have access to those.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, JuanCarlos, for being here. You were great. The chat is on fire.